Chapter 26, The Great West and the Agricultural Revolution, 1865 to 1896. Up to our own day, American history has been, in a large degree, the history of the colonization of the Great West, the existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward. Explain American development. Frederick Jackson Turner, 1893. The white man who possesses this whole vast country from sea to sea, who roams over it at pleasure, and lives where he likes, cannot know the cramp we feel in this little spot, with the undying remembrance of the fact, which you know as well as we, that every foot of what you proudly call America, not very long ago, belonged to the red man. Washaki, Shoshone Indian, 1878. When the Civil War crashed to a close, the frontier line was still wavering westward toward the fabled 100th meridian, which defines the eastern boundary of the West, America's most arid region. A long fringe of settlement, bulging outward here and there, ran roughly north through central Texas and on to the Canadian border. Between this jagged line and the settled areas on the Pacific slope, there were virtually no white people. The few exceptions were the island of Mormons in Utah, occasional trading posts and gold camps, and several scattered Spanish-Mexican settlements throughout the Southwest. Sprawling and expanse, the Great West was a rough square that measured about 1,000 miles on each side. Embracing mountains, plateaus, deserts, and plains, it was the largely parched habitat of the Indian, the buffalo, and the wild horse, the prairie dog, and the coyote. 25 years later, that is, by 1890, the entire domain had been carved into states and the four territories of Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Indian Territory, or Oklahoma. Pioneers flung themselves greedily on this enormous prize, as if to ravish it. Probably never before in human experience had so huge an area been transformed so rapidly. Native Americans numbered about 360,000 in 1860. Many of them scattered about the vast grasslands of the trans-Missouri West. But, to their eternal misfortune, the Indians stood in the path of the advancing white pioneers. An inevitable crash loomed between the acquisitive, industrialized nation and the Indian lifeways, highly evolved over centuries to adapt to the demanding environment of the sparsely watered western plains. Migration and conflict, and sometimes dramatic cultural change, were no strangers in the arid West even before the whites began to arrive. The Comanches had driven the Apaches off the Central Plains into the upper Rio Grande Valley in the 18th century. Harried by Mandans and Chippewas, the Cheyenne had abandoned their villages along the upper reaches of the Mississippi and Missouri River in the century before the Civil War. The Sioux, displaced from the Great Lake woodlands in the 18th century, emerged onto the plains to prey upon the Crows, Kiowas, and Pawnees. Mounted on the Spanish-introduced horses, people like the Cheyenne and the Sioux transformed themselves within just a few generations from foot-traveling, crop-going villagers to wide-ranging nomadic traders and deadly efficient buffalo hunters, so deadly that they threatened to extinguish the vast bison herds that had lured them onto the plains in the first place. When white soldiers and settlers edged onto the plains in the decades just before the Civil War, they accelerated a fateful cycle that exacerbated already fierce enmities among the Indians and ultimately undermined the foundations of the Native American culture. White intruders unwittingly spread cholera, typhoid, and smallpox among the native peoples of the plains, with devastating results. Equally harmful, whites put further pressure on the steadily shrinking bison population by hunting and grazing their own livestock on the prairie grasses. As the once mammoth buffalo herds dwindled, warfare intensified among the plains tribes for ever scarcer hunting grounds. I am traveling all over this country and am cutting the trees of my brothers, an Arikara Indian told a U.S. Army officer along the Platte River in 1835. I am killing their buffalo before my friends arrive so that when they come up they can find no buffalo. The federal government tried to pacify the Plains Indians by signing treaties with the chiefs of various tribes at Fort Laramie in 1851, at Fort Atkinson in 1853. The treaties marked the beginnings of the reservation system in the West. They established boundaries for the territory of each tribe and attempted to separate the Indians into two great colonies, to the north and south of a corridor of intended white settlement. But the white treaty makers misunderstood both Indian government and Indian society. Tribes and chiefs were often fictions of the white imagination, which could not grasp the fact that many Native Americans living in scattered bands recognized only the authority of their immediate families, or perhaps a band elder, And the nomadic culture of the Plains Indians was utterly alien to the concept of living out one's life in the confinement of a defined territory. In the 1860s, the federal government intensified this policy and herded the Indians into the still smaller confines, principally the Great Sioux Reservation in Dakota Territory and Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma, into which dozens of Southern Plains tribes were forced. The Indians surrendered their ancestral lands only when they received solemn promises from Washington that they would be left alone and provided with food, clothing, and other supplies. Regrettably, the federal Indian agents were often corrupt. They palmed off moth-eaten blankets, spoiled beef, and other defective provisions on the friendless Indians. One of these cheating officials, on the annual salary of $1,500, returned home after 4 years with an estimated savings of $50,000. For more than a decade after the Civil War, fierce warfare between Indians and the U.S. Army raged in various parts of the West. Army troops, many of them recent immigrants who had, ironically, fled to Europe to avoid military service, met formidable adversaries in the Plains Indians, whose superb horsemanship gave them baffling mobility. Fully one-fifth of all U.S. Army personnel on the frontier were African American, dubbed "buffalo soldiers" by the Indians, supposedly because of the resemblance of their hair to the bison's furry coat. Receding native population. The Indian wars in the West were often savage clashes. Aggressive whites sometimes shot peaceful Indians on sight just to make sure they would give no trouble. At Sand Creek, Colorado in 1864, Colonel J. M. Chivington's militia massacred in cold blood some 400 Indians, who apparently thought they had been promised immunity. Women were shot praying for mercy, children had their brains dashed out, and braves were tortured, scalped, and unspeakably mutilated. Cruelty begot cruelty. In 1866, a Sioux war party attempting to block construction of the Bozeman Trail to Montana's Goldfield ambushed Captain William J. Fetterman's command of 81 soldiers and civilians in Wyoming's Bighorn Mountains. The Indians left not a single survivor and grotesquely mutilated the corpses. One trooper's face was spitted with 105 arrows. George Armstrong Custer, the buckskin-clad boy general of Civil War fame, now demoted to colonel and turned Indian fighter, wrote that Fetterman's annihilation awakened a bitter feeling towards the savage perpetrators. The cycle of ferocious warfare intensified. The Fetterman massacre led to one of the few, though short-lived, Indian triumphs in the Plains Wars, the Battle of Little Bighorn. In another treaty of Fort Laramie, signed in 1868, the government abandoned the Bozeman Trail. The sprawling Great Sioux Reservation was guaranteed to the Sioux tribes, but in 1874, a new round of warfare with the Plains Indians began when Custer led a scientific expedition into the Black Hills of South Dakota, part of the Sioux Reservation, and announced that he had discovered gold. Hordes of greedy gold seekers swarmed into the Sioux lands. The aggravated Sioux, aided by the Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians, took to the warpath, inspired by the influential and wily Sitting Bull. Colonel Custer's 7th Cavalry, nearly half of them immigrants, set out to suppress the Indians and return them to the reservation, attacking what turned out to be a superior force of some 2,500 well-armed warriors camped along the Little Bighorn River in present-day Montana. The white chief with yellow hair, and about 250 officers and men were completely wiped out. In 1876, when 2 supporting columns failed to come to their rescue. The Indians' victory was short-lived. In a series of battles across the northern plains in the ensuing months, the U.S. Army relentlessly hunted down the Indians who had humiliated Custer. One band of Nez Perce Indians in northeastern Ohio were goaded into daring flight in 1877 when U.S. authorities tried to herd them onto a reservation. Chief Joseph finally surrendered his breakaway band of some 700 Indians after a torturous 1,700-mile, 3-month trek across the continental divide toward Canada. There, Joseph hoped to rendezvous with Sitting Bull, who had taken refuge north of the border after the Battle of Little Bighorn. Betrayed into believing that they would be returned to their ancestral lands in Idaho, the Nez Perce were instead sent to a dusty reservation in Kansas, where 70% of them perished from disease. The survivors were eventually allowed to return to Idaho. Fierce Apache tribes of Arizona and New Mexico were the most difficult to subdue. Led by Geronimo, whose eyes blazed hatred of the whites, they were pursued into Mexico by federal troops using the sun-flashing heliograph, a communication device that impressed the Indians as big medicine. Scattered remnants of the warriors were finally persuaded to surrender after the Apache women had been exiled to Florida. The Apaches ultimately became successful farmers in Oklahoma. This relentless fire and sword policy of the whites at last shattered the spirits of the Indians. The vanquished Native Americans were finally ghettoized onto reservations, where they could theoretically preserve their cultural autonomy, but were, in fact, compelled to eke out a sullen existence as wards of the government. Their white masters had at last discovered that the Indians were much cheaper to feed than to fight, and even so, for many decades they were almost ignored to death. The taming of the Indians was engineered by a number of factors. Of cardinal importance was the federal government's willingness to back its land claims with military forces. Almost as critical was the railroad, which shot an iron arrow through the heart of the West. Locomotives could bring out unlimited numbers of troops, farmers, cattlemen, sheep herders, and settlers. The Indians were also ravaged by the white people's diseases, to which they showed little resistance, and by their firewater, which they could resist even less. Above all, the virtual extermination of the buffalo doomed the Plains Indians' nomadic way of life. Bellowing herds of bison. Tens of millions of buffalo, described by early Spaniards as hunchback cows, blackened the western prairies when white Americans first arrived. These shaggy, lumbering animals were the staff of life for Native Americans. Their flesh provided foods, their dried dung provided fuel, buffalo chips, their hides provided clothing, lariats, and harnesses. When the Civil War closed, some 15 million of these meaty beasts were still grazing on the western plains. In 1868, a Kansas Pacific locomotive had to wait 8 hours for a herd to amble across the tracks. Much of the food supply for the railroad construction gangs came from leathery buffalo steaks. William Buffalo Bill Cody, sinewy, telescope-eyed, and a crack shot, killed over 4,000 animals in 18 months while employed by the Kansas Pacific. With the building of the railroad, the massacre of the herds began in deadly earnest. The creatures were slain for their hides, for their tongues, or a few other choice cuts, or for sheer amusements. Sportsmen on lurching railroad trains would lean out the windows and blaze away at the animals to satisfy their lust for slaughter or excitement. Such wholesale butchery left fewer than 1,000 buffalo alive by 1885, and the once numerous beasts were in danger of complete extinction. The whole story is a shocking example of the greed and waste that accompanied the conquest of the continent. The end of the trail. By the 1880s, the national conscience began to stir uneasily over the plight of the Indians. Helen Hunt Jackson, a Massachusetts writer of children's literature, pricked the moral sense of Americans in 1881 when she published A Century of Dishonor. The book chronicles the sorry record of government ruthlessness and chicanery in dealing with the Indians. Her later novel, Ramona, a love story about discrimination against California Indians, sold some 600,000 copies and further inspired sympathy for the Indians. Debate seesawed. Humanitarians wanted to treat the Indians kindly and persuade them thereby to walk the white man's road. Yet hardliners insisted on the current policy of forced containment and brutal punishment. Neither side showed much respect for Native American culture. Christian reformers, who often administered educational facilities on the reservations, sometimes withheld food to force Indians to give up their tribal religions and assimilate to white society. In 1884, these zealous white souls joined with military men to successfully persuade the federal government to outlaw the sacred Sundance. When the ghost dance cult later spread to the Dakota Sioux, the Army bloodily stamped it out in 1890 at the so-called Battle of Wounded Knee. In the fighting thus provoked, an estimated 200 Indian men, women, and children were killed, as well as 29 invading soldiers. The misbegotten offspring of the movement to reform Indian policy was the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887. Reflecting the forced civilization views of the reformers, the act dissolved many tribes as legal entities, wiped out tribal ownership of land, and set up individual Indian family heads with 160 free acres. If the Indians behaved themselves like good white settlers, they would get full title to their holdings, as well as citizenship in 25 years. The probationary period was later extended, but full citizenship was granted to all Indians in 1924. former reservation lands not allowed to the Indians under the Dawes Act was sold to railroads and white settlers, with the proceeds used by the federal government to educate and civilize the native peoples. In 1879, the government had already funded the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, where Native American children separated from their tribe were taught English and inculcated with white values and custom. Kill the Indian and save the man was the school founder's motto. In the 1890s, the government expanded its network of Indian boarding schools and sent field matrons to the reservations to teach Native American women the art of sewing and to preach the virtues of chastity and hygiene. The Dawes Act struck directly at tribal organizations and tried to make rugged individualists out of the Indians. This legislation ignored the inherent reliance of traditional Indian culture on tribally held land, literally pulling the land out from under them. By 1900, Indians had lost 50% of the 156 million acres they had held just 2 decades earlier. The forced assimilation doctrine of the Dawes Act remained the cornerstone of the government's official Indian policy for nearly half a century, until the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 partially reversed the individualistic approach and belatedly tried to restore the tribal basis of Indian life. Under these new federal policies, defective though they were, the Indian population started to mount slowly. The total number had been reduced by 1887 to about 243,000, the result of bullets, bottles, and bacteria, but the census of 2000 counted more than 1.5 million Native Americans, urban and rural. Mining, from dishpan to oarbreaker. The conquest of the Indians and the coming of the railroad were life-giving boons to the mining frontier. The golden gravel of California continued to yield pay dirt, and in 1858 an electrifying discovery convulsed Colorado. Avid 59ers or Pikes Peakers rushed west to rip at the ramparts of the Rockies. But there were more miners than minerals, and many gold grubbers, with Pikes Peak or Bust inscribed on the canvas of their covered wagon, creaked wearily back with the added inscription, "Busted, by gosh." Yet countless bearded fortune seekers stayed on, some to strip away the silver deposits, others to extract non-metallic wealth from the earth in the form of golden grain. 59ers also poured feverishly into Nevada in 1859 after the fabulous Comstock lode had been uncovered. A fantastic amount of gold and silver, with more than $340 million, was mined by the kings of the Comstock from 1860 to 1890. The scantily populated states of Nevada, child of the Comstock lode, was prematurely railroaded into the Union in 1864, partially to provide 3 electoral votes for President Lincoln. Smaller, lucky strikes drew fantastic gold and silver seekers into Montana, Idaho, and other western states. Boom towns, known as Heldorados, sprouted from the desert sands like magic. Every third cabin was a saloon where sweat-stained miners drank adulterated liquor, rotgut, in the company of accommodating women. Lynch law and hempen vigilante justice, as in early California, preserved a crude semblance of order in the towns. And when the diggings petered out, the gold seekers decamped, leaving eerily picturesque ghost towns such as Virginia City, Nevada, silhouetted in the desert. The gun with the boom, these towns ended with a whimper. Once the loose surface gold was gobbled up, ore-breaking machinery was imported to smash the gold-bearing quartz. This operation was so expensive that it could only be undertaken by corporations, pooling the wealth of stockholders. Gradually, the age of big business came into the mining industry. Dusty, bewhiskered miners, dishpans in hand, were replaced by impersonal corporations, with their costly machinery and trained engineers. The once independent gold washers became just another day laborer. Yet, the mining frontier had played a vital role in conquering the continent. Magnet-like, it attracted population and wealth, while advertising the wonders of the Wild West. Women, as well as men, found opportunities, running boarding houses or working as prostitutes. They won a kind of equality on the rough frontier that earned them the vote in Wyoming in 1869, Utah 1870, Colorado 1893, and Idaho 1896, long before their sisters in the East could cast a ballot. The amassing of precious metals helped finance the Civil War, facilitated the building of railroads, and intensified the already bitter conflict between whites and Indians. The outpouring of silver and gold involved the Treasury to resume specie payments in 1879 and injected the silver issue into American politics. Silver senators, representing the thinly peopled acreage states of the West, used their disproportionate influence to promote the interests of the silver miners. Finally, the mining frontier added to American folklore and literature, as the writings of Bret Harte and Mark Twain so colorfully attest. Beef bonanzas and the long drive. When the Civil War ended, the grassy plains of Texas supported several million tough longhorn cattle. These scrawny beasts, whose horn spreads sometimes reached 8 feet, were killed primarily for their hides. There was no way of getting their meat profitably to market. The problem of marketing was neatly solved when the transcontinental railroads thrust their iron fingers into the West. Cattle could now be shipped alive to the stockyards, and under beef barons like the Swifts and the Armours, the highly industrialized meat packing business sprung into existence as a main pillar of the economy. Drawing upon the gigantic stockyards at Kansas City and Chicago, the meat packers could ship their fresh products into the East Coast in newly perfected refrigerated cars. A spectacular feature of the new slaughterhouses was the long drive. Texas cowboys, black, white, and Mexican, drove herds numbering from 1,000 to 10,000 herds slowly over the unfenced and unpeopled plains until they reached a railroad terminal. These bawling beasts grazed en route on free government grass. Favorite terminal points were fly-specked cow towns like Dodge City, the bibulous Babylon of the frontier, and Abilene, Kansas, Oglala, Nebraska, and Cheyenne, Wyoming. At Abilene, order was maintained by Marshal James B. Wild Bill Hickok, a fabulous gunman who reputedly killed only in self-defense or in the line of duty, and who was fatally shot in the back in 1876 while playing poker. The steer was king in a cattle kingdom richly carpeted with grass. As long as lush grass was available, the long drive proved profitable. That is, to the luckier cattlemen who escaped Indians, stampedes, cattle fever, and other hazards. From 1866 to 1888, bellowing herds totaling over 4 million steers were driven northward from the Beef Bowl of Texas. The steer was king in a cattle kingdom richly carpeted with grass. What the Lord giveth, the Lord also can taketh away. The railroad made the long drive, and the railroad unmade the long drive, primarily because the locomotive ran both ways. The same rails that bore the cattle from the open range into the kitchen brought out the homesteader and the sheep herder. Both of these intruders, sometimes amid flying bullets, built barbed wire fences that were too numerous to be cut down by the cowboys. Furthermore, the terrible winter of 1886 to 1887, with blinding blizzards reached 68 degrees below zero, left thousands of dazed cattle starving and freezing. Overexpansion and overgrazing likewise took their toll, as the cowboys slowly gave way to plowboys. The only escape for the stockmen was to make cattle raising a big business and avoid the perils of overproduction. Breeders learned to fence their ranches, lay in winter feed, import blooded bulls, and produce fewer and meatier animals. They also learned to organize. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association, especially in the 1880s, virtually controlled the state and its legislature. This was the heyday of the cowboy. The equipment of the cowhands, from shooting irons and 10-gallon hats to chaps and spurs, served a useful, not ornamental, function. A genuine gun-toting cowpuncher riding where men were men and smelled like horses could justifiably boast of his toughness. These bow-legged knights at the saddle, with their colorful trappings and cattle-lulling songs, became part of American folklore. Many of them, perhaps 5,000, were blacks, who especially enjoyed the newfound freedom of the open range. The farmer's frontier. Miners and cattlemen created a romantic legend of the West, but it was a sober sodbuster who wrote the final chapter of frontier history. A fresh day dawned for Western farmers with the Homestead Act of 1862. The new law allowed a settler to acquire as much as 160 acres of land, a quarter section, by living on it for 5 years, improving it, and paying a nominal fee of about $30. The Homestead Act marked a drastic departure from previous policy. Before the act, public land had been sold primarily for revenue. Now it was to be given away to encourage a rapid filling of empty spaces and to provide a stimulus to the family farm, the backbone of democracy. The new law was a godsend to a host of farmers who could not afford to buy large holdings. During the 40 years after its passage, about 500,000 farmers took advantage of the Homestead Act to carve out new homes in the vast open stretches. Yet, 5 times that many families purchased their land from the railroads, the land companies, or even the states. The Homestead Act often turned out to be a cruel hoax. The standard 160 acres, quite adequate in the well-watered Mississippi basin, frequently proved pitifully inadequate in the rain-scarce Great Plains. Thousands of homesteaders, perhaps 2 out of the 3, were forced to give up the one-sided struggle against the drought. Uncle Sam, it was said, bet 160 acres against $10 that the settler could not live on their homesteads for 5 years. One of the unsuccessful gambles in Greer County, western Oklahoma, inspired a folk song. Hurrah for Greer County, the land of the free, the land of the bedbug, grasshopper, and flea. I'll sing of its praise, I'll tell of its fame, while starving to death on my government claim. Naked fraud was spawned by the Homestead Act and similar laws. Perhaps 10 times more of the public domain wound up in the clutches of land-grabbing promoters than the hands of bona fide farmers. Unscrupulous corporations would use dummy homesteaders, often their employers or aliens bribed with cash or a bottle of beer, to grab the best properties containing timber, minerals, and oil. Settlers would later swear that they had improved the property by erecting a 12 by 14 dwelling, which turned out to measure 12 by 14 inches. The railways also played a major role in developing the agricultural West, largely through the profitable marketing of crops. Sometimes railroad companies induced Americans and European immigrants to buy the cheap land earlier granted to the railroads by the government. The Northern Pacific Railroad at one time had nearly 1,000 paid agents in Europe, distributing roseate leaflets in various languages. Shattering the myth of the Great American Desert opened the gateways to the agricultural West even wider. The windswept prairies were for the most part treeless, and the tough sod had been pounded solid by millions of buffalo hooves. Pioneer explorers and trappers had assumed that the soil must be sterile, simply because it was not heavily watered and did not support immense forests. But once the prairie sod had been broken with heavy iron plows, pulled by 4 yokes of oxen, the plow that broke the plains, the earth proved astonishingly fruitful. Sodbusters poured onto the prairies. Lacking trees for lumber and fuel, they built homes from the very sod they dug from the ground, and burned corn cobs for warmth. Lured by higher wheat prices resulting from crop failures elsewhere in the world, settlers in the 1870s rashly pushed still further west, onto the poor, marginal lands beyond the 100th meridian. That imaginary line, running north to south from the Dakotas through West Texas, separated 2 climatological regions, a well-watered area to the east and semi-arid to the west. The whiskered and one-armed geologist George Wesley Powell, explorer of the Colorado River's Grand Canyon and director of the U.S. Geological Survey, warned in 1874 that beyond the 100th meridian so little rain fell that agriculture was impossible without massive irrigation. Ignoring Powell's advice, farmers heedlessly chewed up the crusty earth in western Texas, eastern Colorado, and Montana. They quickly went broke as a 6-year drought in the 1860s further desiccated the already dusty region. Western Kansas lost half its population between 1888 and 1892. There is no God west of Salina, one hapless homesteader declared. In the wake of the devastating drought, the new technique of dry farming took root on the plains. Its method of frequent shallow cultivation supposedly were adapted to the arid western environment, but over time, dry farming created a finely pulverized surface soil that contributed to the notorious Dust Bowl several decades later. Other adaptations to the western environment were more successful. Tough strands of wheat, resistant to cold and drought, were imported from Russia and blossomed into billowing yellow carpets. Wise farmers abandoned corn in favor of sorghum and other drought-resistant grains. Barbed wire, perfected by Joseph F. Gilden in 1874, solved the problem of how to build fences on the treeless prairies. Eventually, federally financed irrigation projects on a colossal scale beyond even what John Wesley Powell had dreamed caused the great American desert to bloom. A century after Powell's predictions, arcing dams had tamed the Missouri and Columbia rivers and so penned up and diverted the canyon-gnawing Colorado that its mouth in the Gulf of California was dry. More than 45 acres were irrigated in the 17 western states. In the long run, the hydraulic engineers had more to do with shaping the modern West than all the trappers, miners, cavalrymen, and cowboys ever did. As one engineer boasted, "We enjoy pushing rivers around." The Far West coming of age. The Great West experienced a fantastic surge in migration from the 1870s to the 1890s. A parade of new western states proudly joined the Union. Boomtown, Colorado, offspring of the Pikes Peak's gold rush, was greeted in 1876 as the Centennial State. In 1889 to 1890, a Republican Congress, eagerly seeking more Republican electoral and congressional votes, admitted in a wholesale lot 6 new states: North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming. The Mormon Church formally and belatedly in many Americans' eyes banned polygamy in 1890, but not until 1896 was Utah deemed worthy of admission. Only Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona remained to be lifted into statehood from contiguous territory on the mainland of North America. In a last gaudy fling, the federal government made available to settlers vast stretches of fertile plains formerly occupied by the Indians in the district of Oklahoma, the beautiful land. Scores of overeager and well-armed Sooners, illegally jumping the gun, had entered Oklahoma territory. They had to be evicted repeatedly by federal troops, who, on occasion, would shoot the intruders' horses. On April 22nd, 1889, all was in readiness for the legal opening, and some 50,000 boomers were poised expectantly on the boundary line. At high noon, the bugle shrilled, and a horde of 89ers poured in on the lathered horses or careening vehicles. That night, a lonely spot on the prairie had mushroomed into the tent city of Guthrie, with over 10,000 people. By the end of the year, Oklahoma boasted 60,000 inhabitants, and Congress made it a territory. In 1907, it became the Sooner State.